afterward because they were of a personal nature. So I will just then you have to stay longer to hear about that. Okay, so Sonny has had a long and distinguished career with the state of Wyoming. He's been the superintendent and is now the curator out at Fort Phil Kearny. And I'm sure he has gathered much fantastic information over the time that he has been working out there and studying the events that happened there, the Carringtons and all the cast of characters that made that story so interesting. Sonny's also a graduate of the University of Wyoming. Go Cowboys. I would think that he'll be able to tell you a little bit more about his activities out there at the fort in conjunction with his research. So without further ado, we'd like to welcome Sonny, and he's probably going to play with his PowerPoint gadget over here just a little bit, or you want me to fix that for you?
Hey, he's good. I need a lot of help. Well, thank you all very much. Can you all hear me? Okay. Charlie, can you hear me?
Barely, but keep talking.
Okay. Well, you're kind of my sounding board. And people might be running away from the front, but if you can hear me, I'm okay. Anyway, I'm just really pleased to be here tonight. I didn't realize so many people were starved for entertainment in this town to show up for this. But it is always a pleasure to come and talk to the Historical Society. I haven't had that many opportunities to give programs lately, so bear with me. I might actually be reading my notes and that. Normally I like to kind of wander around and pretend like I know this all in my head, but I'm a little rusty on some of this. And also I've got quite a bit of information that I do want to go over, and we'll just kind of start with that. What we'll do then is first I'll talk for a while, and then I just got about 14 or 15 slides. This was my first attempt at trying to put together one of these programs, and I found out that probably a third grader could do a better job at this time, and they're probably a lot more skilled at it. But when I was putting together this talk, I thought I was really coming up with something novel. I was going to call it Henry Carrington, Soldier, Scholar, and Scapegoat. Well, and then I happened to look at some books today on the internet, and one of them was about the gentleman John D. Lee, the only man executed as part of the Mountain Meadows Massacre in Utah. And a woman named Juanita Brooks had written a book back in, I believe, about 1961 about him, something, and Scapegoat. So I don't know whether I stole the title subconsciously or whether I actually came up my own, but I do apologize for her because my title and hers are very close, but the people are different. Anyway, my talk tonight is on Henry Carrington, and basically when I talk about him, I talk about somebody that I've known now for about 25 years, longer than I've known a lot of my relatives, and a lot closer it seems like. But just starting out about Henry Carrington, and I'll call him the Colonel very often here, so please bear with me on that. Colonel Henry B. Carrington is best remembered today, and has been throughout most of the last 140 years more, as the ill-fated commander of Fort Phil Kearny at the time of the Fetterman Battle. That battle took place December 21st, 1866, in which Captain William J. Fetterman and 80 other men were annihilated by combined forces of Plains Indian warriors very close to Fort Phil Kearny. There are various versions of maybe the famous order that Carrington may or may not have given, or how he gave it, of do not cross Lodge Trail Ridge. But whether that was an order that's actually given or not, it's not the main topic I'm talking about tonight. I thought I'd talk about Carrington the man. And he's really a fascinating individual. Even though he had to spend a majority of his life dealing with the Fetterman battle, he did have quite a career. And even though over the years what he may or may not have said about giving that order has been debated by scholars, we tend to lose point that this was just really a part of his life. He lived to the age of 88, and of that 88 years, only 6 months was spent at Fort Phil Kearny. And for half of your life to be defined by a few hours on one day of your life must have been quite a frustrating feeling for this man, considering the other things that he did. And so while the Fort Phil Kearny will play a prominent part of it, I'll be talking about a number of other things about him that kind of puts him in perspective as a person. Carrington was born in Wallingford, Connecticut on March 2nd, 1824, and he came from a long line of achievers. His grandfather, James Carrington, had been a partner of Eli Whitney and was an inventor and a very significant person. He's prominent in rifle manufacturing for the United States. So there was that kind of military connection way back into the 1700s for the Carrington family. And Henry himself was a very good student. He was well grounded in the classics and the science, although he developed an early interest in military science and military history, and that would eventually become his major occupation later in life. Like the rest of the family, he became an early advocate of abolition, and he claimed one of the things that he said had influenced him, that he had attended a speech by John Brown up in New England, talking about slavery, and that had set the tone for him, that strengthened his resolve in this matter. Even though he wanted to attend West Point, he had a lung ailment that prevented him. He was sickly as a young man. And so he went to Yale instead and graduated with a degree in the classics and the natural sciences in 1845. From 1846 to 47, he taught at the at the Irving Institute with the famous American writer Washington Irving. Became associated with him. I believe he served as his secretary for a while, and kind of acquired and deepened his writing skills and skills that would serve him well later in life. And he began to hone those research and writing skills that he would use as he developed into his manhood. In 1847, he returned to Yale, and in 1848, he earned a law degree. And then he took kind of the Horace Greeley advice and went west. Well, he only went to Ohio, but that was the West back in the 1840s. And he moved to Columbus and entered into a practice in corporate law with a gentleman named William Dennison, who would be a future governor of Ohio. And this in many ways launched Carrington on his political career. In 1854, he's one of the founders of the Republican Party in Ohio, and became prominent in the Midwest region as a politician. It gave a political outlet for his abolitionist viewpoints, and so he was very strong with the Republican Party. He got to know Lincoln, he got to know a number of other people back then. Helen gave a great program on Lincoln last month, and so it's interesting to think that Carrington's past probably crossed with Lincoln quite a bit in this early founding of the Republican Party. And he's good at politics, he's good at the law, but he still had these old military dreams that he had. And after marrying a member of a prominent family in Ohio, Margaret Sullivan, in 1851, and she came from quite a background. Her father was the founder of Ohio State University. She's also related to the Chief Justice John Marshall, previous Justice of the United States, to President James Madison, and a relative of hers, George Irwin McDowell, would be the commander of the First Battle of Manassas in Virginia in 1861. And so quite a prominent family that probably they were quite the couple when you saw Henry and Margaret, and probably attending a lot of political conventions and a lot of social events in Ohio. And life looked pretty good to the young lawyer and politician then. In 1857, a close friend of Carrington's, Ohio Governor Solomon P. Chase, He's a future presidential candidate and a member of Lincoln's team of rivals that Helen talked about last time during the Civil War. Made Henry's lifelong dream come true. He was appointed to the job of reorganizing the Ohio militia. And he proved himself to be a natural military organizer. Although without formal training in that field, he read and studied and did talk to people that were career military people. And he did such a job, he was appointed Ohio's first adjutant general, and would serve in that capacity up until the time that the Civil War broke out in 1861. Now, his political connections also provided one of those first opportunities of intrigue. And it's interesting that when Lincoln was traveling back to Washington, as he was going through the Midwest, that Carrington served as one of his bodyguards as the train went through Ohio. And you hear Carrington talk about it. He had a pistol in his pocket. There were assassins at about every corner. But probably, oops, sorry, my mic just picked up a little bit here. Yeah. Okay. But anyway, so he managed to make this quite an adventure of him as one of the protectors of Lincoln on the trip back to Washington. When war broke out in 1861, Carrington raised and sent 10 regiments of Ohio volunteers into Western Virginia and probably saved that region for the Union. Now, he didn't go commanding himself. He was the organizer. He raised the regiments and trained them. And as a reward for this, as part of that political commissions that were prominent back there in the early part of the Civil War, he was appointed as a full regular colonel in the United States Army. And this wasn't a volunteer, he was in the regular army as colonel of the 18th United States Infantry, one of the first regiments he raised, and this would carry through later into his career. At that time, he had to settle for less than command on the battlefield. Later there'd be talk that Carrington had dodged going into warfare himself. And that's one of the knocks on him, is that by historians and by many of his contemporary detractors, especially in the military field, is that he didn't have combat experience. And that's true, although it was more the success of his organizational skills than any desire by him to avoid combat that really led to this. Because of his political connections, because of the fact that he was so good at raising and training troops, they did not send him to the front. They kept him in the Midwest doing that. Over the next years, he organized thousands of volunteers in Ohio and Indiana, and sent, he figured anywhere probably about 100,000 troops into the war through that. He also became involved in some political intrigues that were prominent back then. One of the great fears is that there were subversives, Democratic Party sympathizers, Southern sympathizers, that were organizing to overthrow the Western governments and take those states of Ohio, Illinois, and Indiana into the Confederacy. And organizations such as the Sons of Liberty and Knights of the Golden Circle alarmed a number of politicians and military authorities in that area. And Carrington was brought in as a hunter of these people. Basically, he became one of the people leading the anti-espionage efforts against supposed subversives in the area. They call these people copperheads because they equate them with snakes. It's always good if you can equate your enemy with something slithery like a snake, so they called them copperheads at that time. And from 1863 until the end of the war, Carrington was stationed in Indiana, and he spent his time hunting copperheads and arresting people and imposing martial law through Indiana, Ohio, and those areas there. He's responsible for many arrests, and that earning the gratitude of the Republican politicians in the area and the hatred of the Democratic Party in that area there. Unfortunately, many of his fellow military officers, many of whom were wartime Democrats, thought that he was overbearing, that he had basically usurped things like the writ of habeas corpus and had suspended liberty in the name of trying to arrest people. And that's always a problem during warfare, as we've seen in many wars since then. When you're protecting your country and when you're overstepping on the liberty and the rights of others. He did have one chance, though, at military glory. In 1863, John Hunt Morgan, a Confederate raider out of Kentucky, led a group of cavalry on a raid up through Ohio, and it was really quite a raid, and word came to Carrington that Morgan's troops were moving through the area. He loaded a regiment on a train, and fortunately, this is where we see one of his first things that were similar to what Custer went through. One of Custer's most embarrassing wartime circumstances when he was a young officer, he went back to Monroe, Michigan, and Libby Custer, Elizabeth Custer, was coming down the street, and George had had too much to drink and just about fell down the street in front of her. And Carrington is believed probably took some liberal courage, or some liquid courage, let me put it that way, liberally used liquid courage, I'll put it like that, before he mounted this train with his troops, and he didn't make the train. So he missed the train, he missed his one chance at combat during the war. And like Custer, he then became a teetotaler for the rest of his life. But you know, it's one of those experiences that you would never hear from him because he's very much a product of the Victorian society. But still, because of his political activities, because of his organizational skills in organizing troops and hunting out subversives, in 1865 he was appointed as a brevet general of volunteers and finished out the war. Eventually, after the war was over, he rejoined his regiment, the 18th United States Infantry, as a full colonel. And this is one of the things that really irritated a lot of officers. Officers such as George Custer, people who were brigadier and major generals, volunteers in combat during the Civil War. Once the war ended, they suddenly reverted back to the rank of lieutenants or captains, majors, and to see suddenly someone who had no military training by their standards, who had really no combat experience, and Carrington joined his regiment, the 18th United States Infantry, as a full colonel in the regular army, and leaped over everybody. And again, this must have been, and was an irritation, as those of you who might have read the Fort Kearny story know, that a lot of the officers had a great dislike of Carrington because of that. And it was a galling thing for people like Fetterman, Brown, and those at Fort Kearny. In the winter of 1865, after he joins his regiment, they marched to Fort Kearny, Nebraska, and there they prepared to go out to the plains. For whatever reason, I was asked this a while back, why did they send this regiment of infantry out here instead of cavalry, to deal with the Plains Indian? Well, several reasons. One is that the Indian Bureau, a number of others were saying a treaty had been signed in 1865. There really wasn't a war out here. There was definitely, at times more raiding wars. It wasn't an organized war, but there was war between the Plains Indians and people traveling on the trails and the troops in the area. But that was one thing that influenced them. And the other thing being that the United States Army was stretched thin. There was a possible war going to take place down in the border with Mexico, with France, because France had invaded Mexico during the Civil War and had set up Emperor Maximilian as a ruler in Mexico. We were possibly going to go to war, so we had 50 or 60,000 troops down there. George Custer was stationed down there in 1865, early 1866. We also had the occupation of the South, so a number of troops were employed down in the southern states in occupation duty. So regiments such as the 18th Infantry, it was decided they wanted to get all the volunteer troops out of the West, bring back the regular army, and unfortunately for the 18th Infantry, they were infantry and they were stationed out here in a place where probably cavalry should have been stationed out in these plains. Now also at Fort Kearny, Nebraska, Margaret Carrington and a number of the other ladies visited with General William Sherman, the commanding general of the district, had been out. And he advised them that even though it was going to be a peaceful stay out there in the West, that they should possibly keep diaries of their experiences. And Margaret Carrington took that to heart, and so that's when she began keeping her diary that eventually would lead to the book, Absaraka, that I'll talk about a little bit later here. Well, I won't go into much detail about the events in the Bozeman Trail itself. Those are the things that, the 18th Infantry did march up the Bozeman Trail. They eventually garrisoned 3 forts, Fort Reno, Fort Phil Kearny, and Fort C.S. Smith, and they found that the Indians weren't all that peaceful. And then pretty soon warfare did break out, and it was kind of one of those guerrilla-type warfares. Carrington kept pleading for reinforcement supplies. The people back, his commander, did not understand it, General Philip St. George Cook, and the Indian Department was saying there really isn't a war, we have a peace treaty. And so there was that struggle going on. Eventually, Fort Phil Kearny itself, the newly established fort on the Planning, would be under siege. And there would also be conflict amongst the officers, both because of Carrington's reputation as a lack of combat experience as a political officer, and also because these were guys, many of them had been shot up. For instance, late Lieutenant Adair, who was Carrington's post adjutant, he had a musket ball lodged right in his neck that he could never operate on. Captain James Powell had 2 musket balls lodged in his body. And so the 18th Infantry had been an experienced outfit, but many of these officers really were almost shell-shocked by the war itself. And there would be continual skirmishes going on around Fort Phil Kearny. And then in the fall, there would arrive officers that would be of great desire to Carrington. One of them being George Grumman, who would bring his young wife, Frances Grumman, with him, and William J. Federer. And those 2 men would play a great part in the future of Carrington and his family. On December 6th, Carrington did get a baptism of fire. He rode out as part of an attack plan against the Indians. This was his only real contact with Indians in actual battle, and really his only real contact in actual battle in his career. And he describes that he himself emptied a saddle with 1 shot from his pistol during this battle. So he may have actually shot someone in the battle, and he had experienced combat there. And then finally, after that, which almost turned into a disaster in itself, the Indians had sprung a trap in that battle. On December 21st, Captain William Fetterman led out his troops, 80 men, may or may not have boasted that he could lead 80 men through the Sioux Nation. Well, he made it 4 miles. And the 80 men and Captain Fetterman died in the span of probably 20 minutes. And that's when the second half of Colonel Carrington's life began. On the 22nd, he went out and brought in, some of the bodies had been brought in the day of the battle. The next day, he took out men. So he really wasn't a coward. He went out and commanded the troops and brought back the bodies of the troops that had been killed in the battle. And so in that sense, he showed, December 6th is showing that he certainly wasn't a coward in battle that way. But the stigma of that event already was starting to hang over. And there would be a number of accusations against Carrington that he didn't have control of his troops, he didn't control of his officers, that he hadn't supported Fetterman, and that he had mismanaged the whole situation at Fort Phil Kearny. And then the rumor began that he was replaced because of the Fetterman fight. Actually, it was already lined up that he and the part of the regiment, the 18th Infantry, were going to be transferred, and that the troops at Fort Phil Kearny would become a whole new regiment called the 27th. And so as far back as September, Carrington knew that he was being transferred out of Fort Phil Kearny. Now maybe it sped up a little bit, but anyway, in the middle of January, in a terrible blizzard. And for those of you that might have been on the roads last night or this morning, I'll give you an idea, probably what Carrington and his people had to travel through when they left Fort Phil Kearny in January of 1867 and traveled down to Fort Casper. There's accounts that at least 2 of the men just froze their feet and had to have their legs or their feet amputated by the time they got to Fort Casper. Quite a horrible journey, and accounted for in both of Mrs. Carrington books. I'll be talking about it a little bit later here. Well, he went down to Fort Casper, found out that his headquarters, the 18th Infantry, had been moved to Fort McPherson in western Nebraska, so he took off for there. Between Fort Casper and Fort Laramie, he thought there was an Indian attack coming. He pulled out his pistol to go ahead to see what was going on and shot himself in the leg. And just barely missed the femoral artery, darn near killed himself. And that's a wound that would eventually end his military career. So anyway, now Carrington had experienced not only combat, but he'd experienced what it's like to be shot, even if he did have to inflict it on himself. So, but eventually he would recover from that wound, although it would hurt him for the rest of his life. From 1867 to 1870, he's at Fort Sedgwick in Colorado and at Fort McPherson in western Nebraska. And it's interesting because he also met George Custer there. George Custer in the 7th Cavalry came into Fort McPherson. And Carrington gives this great account of him and Custer going out and talking to these Indians. It's quite a detailed account. Now, exactly how he remembered all this, and exactly what was said, but he's got this whole conversation down, and that shows up in one of the editions of his first wise book, Absaraka. But anyway, he has this great account of him and Custer out there. Other story was that Custer, one of the things I heard, Custer didn't spend much time with him because he thought associating with him was bad because of the stigma of the Fetterman fight. But according to Henry Carrington's writing, they were pretty good buddies. So the battle to clear his name, though, began quite early. And actually it began just about as soon as they left Fort Phil Kearny. One of the things that happened is that Lieutenant William Bisbee, who was at the fort, had went back and basically he didn't like Carrington, so he started the story that Carrington was totally out of control and Carrington wasn't. And then he went to work for Carrington's superior back in Omaha, where he could really do some damage. Generals Grant and Sherman also wanted to cover things up, because if Carrington submitted all these reports, and if it's true that because ammunition hadn't come, because he hadn't received cavalry, then that made the Army look bad. And the decision was pretty much made to suppress most of Carrington's information, and it would be suppressed for years, and to make basically so the Army would not look bad. Well, specifically so Grant and Sherman wouldn't look bad in this situation here. Grant himself had presidential aspirations coming up, and Sherman wanted to be the next commander of the Army and move up the ranks. But they couldn't get rid of Carrington because of his political connections. William Sherman's brother was a senator from Ohio and was friends of Carrington, so it was a little awkward. And so the best thing was to kind of shovel him around and shuffle him off and leave him in his frontier posts. And every time his documents come back, they'd get pigeonholed, and they would not be published or sent on to Congress or anything like that. And this went on from 1867 to 1870, but the Carringtons, Henry and Margaret, struck back. Margaret Carrington had kept this great diary, these journals, from the time that they'd left Fort Kearny, Nebraska. And she began writing, and probably Henry helped her with the writing, since he was very skilled in that. And she was a very competent writer in her own right, and she used a lot of information. And but in 1868, barely Fort Phil Kearny and all of those Fort Phil Kearny and the Bozeman Trail forts were banned in 1868. But probably the ashes had barely cooled from there being burned, and Absaraka, Margaret Carrington's book, came out. Became a classic, sold out bestseller. and went into several different editions over the years, and it's still it's still being published today. But a good account of the Fort Phil Kearny perspective of the frontier from a woman's perspective, and also probably one of the best accounts we have of the frontier fort life and of the Indian Wars itself. Unfortunately, Margaret also suffered from a disease that possibly Henry Carrington was the cause of. Not by anything he did, his own fault, but that he was probably a tuberculosis carrier. And in 1870, Margaret Carrington, at the age of 39, would die of tuberculosis, and eventually several of his children and his second wife would also die of tuberculosis. So this man had a lot of burdens on him, besides the situation of the Fetterman fight and his military career really going to pieces after that. But the battle would continue as far as him trying to clear his name. However, after Margaret died, Frances Grumman, whose husband had been killed in the Fetterman fight and had been a young widow and had traveled with the Carringtons from Fort Phil Kearny, eventually back to her home in Tennessee, she contacted Henry Carrington and they would marry. And so then Frances Grumman would become Frances Carrington, and they in turn would have another entirely new family in their lives, and that would be the second half of Henry Carrington's life, into his 40s until his 80s when both of them would pass away. In 1870 also, the Army was overjoyed because they finally found a way to get rid of Carrington and get him out of the Army. His career wasn't going anywhere. He was commanding his frontier forts. He was making noises about how come my reports and everything about the Fetterman fight haven't come out, how come. So he's really kind of a problem in that way. And they were beginning to establish military science programs in colleges. And so Colonel Carrington took an early retirement and was appointed as professor of military science, also math and classics, at Wabash College in Indiana. And he would serve there for several years as a professor and as an instructor in military science. Unfortunately for our good colonel, the students at Wabash did not find him any more they didn't greet him any more enthusiastically than perhaps his officers had greeted him when he at Fort Phil Kearny. In that these young men, he was instructor of military science, so he had them out there drilling. And the budget was a little tight. This is a predecessor to the ROTC programs of today, the ROTC programs. But he'd gotten a hold of an artillery piece and an ammunition limber that you pull with horses, but he didn't have any horses. So his idea was that half of his students would be the horses, and the other half would be the gun crew. And the students were unanimous and put you into the horse. They were identifying with the colonel at that stage, and it wasn't the head. But anyway, eventually the students, one night they went out, they got enough powder, and he hadn't done any live firing before they got the powder to shoot this thing. They loaded it full of scrap metal, and there was an old outdoor privy by the side of the parade ground that everybody kind of hated anyway. And so they touched it off and blew the privy apart, and the military science program was canceled and ended at Wabash College. The colonel continued to teach his classic and his sciences there for a while, but pretty much but really officially ended his military career stage in the game. But he did do a lot of writing, and this is a thing that people don't realize about him, is everything is about Fort Phil Kearny and that 6 months and that terrible day, December 21st. However, here's just a list of the publications of some of what he had written. And this is how varied the man was. 1847, The Scourge of the Alps, about the Hannibal coming over from the Alps with their elephants. Russia Among the Nations and American Classics in 1849. Battles of the American Revolution, 1775 to 81, in 1876. This is a classic that's still used today, still used at West Point, and still published. You get it now it's an online publication, but a number of students in military science have to read that book. It's a classic. Crisis Thoughts, I'm not sure what that was. Battle Maps and Charts of the American Revolution. The Indian Question, that I'll be talking about in a few minutes here. Battles of the Bible. Boston, New York, 1775 and 1776. Washington the Soldier. And the Exodus of the Flathead Indians in 1902. So over these years, and plus he also would edit Tsiraka, Land of the Crows, Margaret Carrington's book several times. And he would also play a role in his second wife's book, My Army Life, that I'll be talking about here in a couple minutes here. So anyway, quite a prolific fellow in terms of that writing that way. He also found time, he served on commissions dealing with the Flathead Indians in Montana in 1889, and he conducted census of the Iroquois in New York and the Cherokee in Oklahoma in 1890. And so he definitely, besides a number of other things, lecturing, went to England, lectured to a number of scientific societies on Indians, and really quite an interesting guy. In fact, I'll just read a little bit of one of his things from the Indian Question that and it kind of gives an idea. And as he wrote over the years, also his attitude towards the Indians had changed. You think of Fort Phil Kearny and what that must have been like, and he had good reason to be kind of bitter against the Indians because the experience was there in that way. But this is just something, and this is a little article he wrote for the, let's see, where's the description of it? An address by General Henry B. Carrington before the geographical and biological sections of the British Association for the Advancement of Science. So he went over to England and proceeded to lecture over there with all these British generals. And this is his explanation of, like, for the mutilations at Fort Phil Kearny. I was asked yesterday to explain why the Indians used arrows so freely upon the bodies of their victims. It is a part of their superstition or religion. While they will not often use again an arrow shot at an enemy if it misses him because the Great Spirit did not wish it to hit, they count to their credit every act of courage. Thus, when in a single combat the red man would fail to get the scalp unless his friend who helps it shoots arrows in the body and keeps the record to show that while he did not get the scalp, he was the cause of it being secured. The very cheap dull knife, when in 1866 he refused to join Red Cloud at the first outbreak of war, was slashed across the shoulders with a bow in contempt with a cry of "Coup, coward!" And these coups are recorded by knots tied in their ponies' manes as the next thing to victory. So the arrows used upon a body under state of facts such as given are so many coups to the credit of the warrior. The hundreds of arrows found in the bodies after the Fetterman massacre show that the whole force of the Red Man was employed to silence the brave men who fought with desperation against an overwhelming force. It is enough for us to know that white men first stole their lands and then sold them arms, and did by every low passion work out the scheme by which we should treat the Indian as a brute, only to be exterminated rather than as a man to be saved. In the horrors of that calamity, when loved companions fell so suddenly after safely passing the ordeal of 4 years of war, and it seemed as if there was no salvation for the rest of the small force in Dakota, and when our wives and our children were in peril, so that no one knew when the next hour would be of toil and trial, I could not but feel that if I had been a red man, I would have fought as bitterly, if not as cruelly, for my rights and my home as the red man fought. And here's where he kind of also preaches, be it our part to strengthen the hand of those who would save the red man, so that the eternal disgrace of extinction shall not attach to America, but Christianity as its strength and its glory. So it's an interesting perspective, and again it shows another side to the man at that time, and also shows that he was kind of paying attention to things like the mutilations and things that were taking place out in the battlefields. One of the things that he did do, though, is that I mentioned about how he had worked over some editions of Margaret's book, Margaret Carrington's book, Abstract, which was published in 1868. And Mary and Alan and I were talking about that the other day. Incoming. One of the things that he did do, he had several editions. In 1879, he did something that I find pretty amazing, which you don't find in print. It's an out-of-print book today, and possibly maybe Alan might know if it's still in existence. But the 1879 edition, he added 3 chapters to it, which is basically a history of the Indian Wars from 1865 to 1877, including the Little Bighorn, the Nez Perce, the southern plains, and a number of battles along that way. And he also added, of course, the justifications of why he wasn't responsible for the Fetterman battle, added chapters on that. But he also, in this preface to the 3rd edition, describes, talking about Custer, and this is again 1878, so, well actually it was published, I'm sorry, it was 1878. During January 1876, General Custer said to the writer, "It will take another Phil Kearny massacre to bring Congress up to a generous support of the Army." Within 6 months, his memory, like that of Fetterman, became monumental through a similar catastrophe. With larger experience on the frontier, for Fetterman had none, but with equal faith in the ability of white troops to handle a larger, superior force of Indians, fearless, brave, and a matchless rider, Custer had also the conviction that the Army was expected to fight the hostile savage under all circumstances and at every opportunity. So again, he's already, it's 2 years after the Little Bighorn, he already had an opinion on that. And Custer wasn't around to say whether they really met in January of 1876 or not. But anyway, it's one of those deals that, and I think that they had talked probably when Custer was passing through or something, but Carrington was just amazing how he just gathered this stuff up. And just another quick little quote. Okay. There is no glory in Indian war. If too little is done, the West complains. If too much is done, the East denounces the slaughter of red man. Just that Indian policy, which was inaugurated during the official term of President Grant, is justified. And so he's already making comments because Grant had a peace policy at that time. So much falsehood mingled with fact, and so keen was the popular scent for some scapegoat at the first public announcement of war, which had been constant for 6 months. And he's talking about the Fetterman fight again, and basically calling himself the scapegoat. That even now the public mind retains a vague impression of the lessons of that massacre. It was indeed required that another fearful tragedy to invoke an examination linked into the relations of the American people towards their Indian tribes, and to solve the problem whether a Christian nation will exercise patience, restraint, wrong, and do what is right by both races. So, and then just one final thing from this 3rd edition, he talks about the Fort Phil Kearny story and about his wife, Margaret. It is no weak incentive to the enlargement of this record that the sacrifice of Fetterman, Brown, Custer, Bradley, Bradley had been killed in the Nez Perce War, and their associates is kept in memory, while tribute is ever paid to her whose life so soon passed away after the trials of that unexpected and extreme exposure. Talking about his first wife that way there. So this would continue and go on, and it's interesting in that during the 1890s and early 1900s, a number of historians began to consult with Carrington. He's one of these last old surviving people of frontier wars, and he never failed to lay out his defense for the Fetterman disaster. First, Coutance's History of Wyoming, and then Cyrus Townsend Brady's Indian Fights and Fighters, it's published about 1907, if I remember right, were influenced by the Carrington's input. And Brady especially advocated the Lodge Trail Ridge Orders account. Do not cross Lodge Trail Ridge. And this is a theme that has continued for years. And Carrington would be pleased, I guess, that maybe his imprint had finally been made. In 1887, they'd also finally published his accounts. Grant and Sherman were gone and no longer mattered. And so, in many ways, he had been vindicated by then. And finally, in 1908, he and his second wife, Frances Carrington, would come to Sheridan, and many may have seen the pictures of the celebration out at the Fetterman Monument in 1908, when he would get up and speak there at that time at the monument. And in 1911, Frances' book, My Army Life, would be published. And once again, Colonel Carrington had input in that. And that was maybe the final vindication of that story of Fort Phil Kearny that he wanted to tell about what had happened at the Fetterman fight, and that he was not really responsible for it. In 1912, the end finally came. First Frances died, and then on October 26th, Henry joined her. I do have a few slides, and we'll finish up with those, and then I'll take any questions.
How big a guy was he, son?
What?
How big a guy was he?
Well, he's probably about 5. The minute we'll see him standing next to some people, I'd say he's about 5'6", maybe 5'7". This is him during the Civil War, as a young man, probably late 30s, very early 40s. I'm going to have you hit the space bar there. Yeah. So again, see him at that age. Here he is later. Here he has his general stars on for his brevet brigadier general. This is an honorary rank for him, but he's, at this stage, he is probably about, it's been right around the Fort Phil Kearny period, probably around, he'd be about 42, 43 years old. Okay. Yeah, he's aged a little bit. It's about a week after the Fetterman fight. No. Anyway, you can see that now he's wearing his colonel rank on his epaulets there. But you can see the age in his eyes. So this would be probably about the time he's getting ready to, after he retired, somewhere in the 1870s, when the young men at Wabash College had given him that not too good of exit there. Okay, and here we see him later in life. Here he is when he's probably in his 70s, early 80s, probably his 70s. But you can see now he's got a lot more metals and hardware on. I don't see any metal for the train that he missed, but anyway. Okay, we'll go on to the next one. And this one wasn't the best. I should have gotten a better shot. This one here is out at the Fetterman battle. And I don't know, for those of you that have been in the service, how many you can still fit in your uniforms. But as you can see, he is still wearing his uniform at this stage. And still quite dapper in it. And he has somebody holding an umbrella. And he's out there giving a speech at the Fetterman battle wearing his uniform. And this is July 4th of 1908. Okay, go to the next one. Well, let me see if I can get this down to size here. We can look at some people. Fun looking bunch, aren't they?